Now that all the dignitaries have arrived. I welcome everyone. This is day 2. You're all holding up all right. I think you're all looking very healthy and rested. Okay, good. Before we proceed, I guess we need to make a decision about Sunday. Abhishek has proposed that we meet on Sunday and then take the following Wednesday as our day off after one full week. I am neutral on this topic. Do any of you have any reflections on this?
It's fine with us.
It's fine with the Arjun contingent?
Arjun contingent. I think one of them might have a problem because he teaches classes on Sunday.
Okay.
So what do I need to do? Oh, my voice is not loud enough. I can shout louder enough.
Everyone else is okay with the plan to meet on the following Wednesday off? Yes?
Yes, I think.
Yes? Okay, great. Now, today we're going to reflect on the more historically and theoretically on the committed documentary and think about the archive that is the history of this form and the canon of this form, that is documentaries over the last century or more that we continue to look at and value and try to understand. For this purpose, I asked you to read two things. An essay that I wrote in the early 1980s on committed documentary that tries to define it and establish the various criteria of belonging to this category. And I also assigned you an excerpt from my book on Evans, which elaborates on his passage in the early 1930s that led to the making of the film Borinage that we saw yesterday evening. So we have a more abstract taxonomical discussion in the first lecture today. What do we mean by this category of committed documentary? What do they contain? And then in the second lecture, we'll have a little bit more of the historical and textual analysis of Evans' social practice and textual practice, his artistic practice around the film Borinage. So everyone is happy with that? Okay. There are lots of problems with exploring committed documentaries in the archive. First of all, the obvious problem of preservation. Two of the films we looked at last evening were rescued from oblivion. They were orphan films. They were rescued by a museum and rendered into usable formats for the 21st century. Preservation is a terrible problem because these films are not valued as works of art. Usually they are discarded. They're ephemeral. And access to them is a matter of luck or randomness, even on the internet. So we were actually very lucky to be able to access several of the works on the internet yesterday evening, but it's a process of chance and hazard. The other problem, the other challenge is how do we interpret films rescued from the archive in a vacuum? What do they mean? We had a very interesting discussion afterwards about these 4 films. And we had varied interpretations, but there were also mysteries involved. there were blind spots. What does this mean? What does that mean? And sometimes we can never answer that question. Sometimes we can also, sometimes we just historicize a work and can gradually come to understand what its references are, what it means. The canon is a collection of works we value, our cultural heritage, and the problems with the archive demonstrate how arbitrary the canon is. Those of you who are English teachers, for example, know we all study Shakespeare and Forster, but not X, Y, and Z. Sometimes this canonization is completely arbitrary, sometimes it's meaningful, sometimes it's simply about access. I introduced the 4 films. There are the 4 films we looked at yesterday: Kino Pravda, Vorinage, National Hunger March, Voices from Balyapal. I introduced them as pioneering films, but of course the problem of pioneer is problematical. Whenever in cultural history we say that something must be first, inevitably we're going to be wrong. There's always going to be a precursor or an ancestor. And the pioneer implies that an artist developed a language, a format, a practice that would influence subsequent generations. Sure of that, what if subsequent generations had the same problems of access that we do? And in fact, in many of these cases, these films were not known by subsequent generations. So the concept of pioneer is problematical. Those of you who are doing feminist scholarship also raised your eyebrows a little bit because the films were all wrapped up in a structure of male authorship. But when we looked at Indonesia Calling, I revealed that behind the scenes there were 2 very important women collaborators, and if Evans had been working in the 21st century, he would have shared authorship credit with those other 2 women. So the concept of the pioneer, very often a male pioneer, needs to be scrutinized as well. So our challenge is always to historicize these works rescued from the archive. There's really no such thing as an orphan film. They all belong to history, and this is our challenge as scholars. If we look at these 4 films, I've tried to include images from the 4 of them. Kino Pravda on your left, then coming over towards the right, Voices from Balyapal, that's the poster. And then the image from Vorinage. Remember the demonstration at the end of the film where the striking workers are carrying the portrait of Marx. Logo for U.S. newsreel that produced activist films throughout the late 60s and 1970s, and we'll be coming to one in a future class. So, I'm curious, those of you who saw the films, I know that the Arjun contingent is coming for the first time, so didn't see the films, but some of these are available on the internet, so I hope you will catch them. Those of you who saw them, I'm wondering if 4 such disparate films seem to belong together. If so, what is the nature of that belonging? What do they have in common? What are their continuities? And what are their disjunctures? What is so different among these 4 works? It's a 50-year time span, a 60-year time span represented by these films. Are there continuities in the films that have spanned those 60 years? Anyone, any suggestions for that? Did Voices from Balyapal have anything in common whatsoever with Kino Pravda or Vorinage in terms of its social practice in terms of its textual practice, content of the images. Now that you've all had a chance to sleep on this experience, any insights? I will start, and then you can join in. Obviously, all 4 films have demonstrations in them, don't they? They belong to the demonstration genre of films that show people in public space celebrating or voicing their anger or making political claims, very often facing state violence, but in the case of Kino Pravda, not facing state violence, but in support of the young society that is being shaped at that very moment in 1922. So these films all are about street theater, aren't they? The demonstration as a public act that can intersect with the filmmakers and intersect with us, the audience. The interesting thing about the demonstration in Borinage is that it was reenacted. The filmmakers missed the event. I'm going to use the microphone because I'm losing my voice. Here it is. Okay, is this better? Yes. The filmmakers have missed the original event, so they're collaborators in the community to reenact it for the camera. Normally, we think on the surface that reenactment should not be part of a documentary repertory, but in fact, it always has been. But in fact, this reenactment became a real demonstration because the police were watching, and the police circled in on it and beat everyone up because they thought it was a real demonstration. So in fact, it became a real demonstration. So there was a kind of interactive process in the act of filming and demonstrating that transformed the film in an important way. So you could argue also that the demonstrations in Baliapal had a similar kind of interactive relationship with the filmmakers. To what extent are these amazing marches and those demonstrations performed for posterity, for the camera, as well as for the agents of the state police? It's an interesting question. Okay, did any of you notice any other continuities among these 4 films? Any tropes or iconographies or structures or political messages, any kinds of rhetoric or stories of narratives that seem to carry through? Anyone? Rajni. Can we get a mic to her also, please? Oh, there's no battery in that one. Oh, okay. It's working. Okay, sorry. I don't need 2 mics, that's for sure.
What I felt, which was very, very common and relevant in all the films that we watched yesterday, a basic political ideology that belonged to the left. That kind of ideology was persistent in all the 4 films. We could see the class struggle and the common man versus the individual versus the state conflict was evident in all the films. The film were also very futuristic because each one was trying to strike a question saying, what is our future? Where does it belong? So that way I found the film very futuristic. What was the point of disjuncture for me, or what set the films apart for me, was especially in Balyapal. I think there were more feminist voices, and there was more space given to females in terms of asserting what they want and what role they are playing in the whole struggle, which was not evident in other films. Those are my quick observations with the 4 films that we watched.
Okay, those are some interesting points. Futuristic is an interesting concept. Perhaps you mean that in all 4 films, citizens are creating their future, are imagining the end goal that they're building. And in this sense, all of the films include a kind of idealized action, a kind of exemplary positive action for us to imitate. There's a kind of proposed mimesis going on, a kind of proposed imitation. And in this way, you could call all of these films utopian, even though they're all about action on the street. They're also about imagining the future, aren't they? What will the workers' paradise look like? What will their utopia look like? Whether we're talking about the Soviet Union, where people in 1922 are participating in politics for the first time, reading newspapers, attending trials, walking about on the street, looking at films, making films, or whether we're talking about the other 3 films in which citizens are concerted against the state. In every case, they are imagining their future. In terms of gender politics, does anyone have anything to add to what Rajni said? If you think back at Borinage or even Pino Pravda, in any fleshing out her comment, I mean, they do look like real patriarchal universes. For example, the miners' wives are depicted as supporting characters, not as principal antagonists, right? And there's a certain kind of pathos built around the women characters. They're pregnant, they're breastfeeding, they can't provide for their children. So it's a kind of maternal familial role that is emphasized. But at the same time, in the final scene, remember the women are on the street raising their fists in the demonstration? There's sort of a glimpse of a larger role for women in that film. And even in Kino Pravda, the women are avid journalists and consumers of media and information, aren't they? If you looked at an American newsreel from 1922, I think women would have been even more absent, except if it was a newsreel of a beauty pageant or some kind of light entertainment. So it's a very complex issue. But thank you for raising it. Any other continuities or disjunctures that anyone noticed among the 4 films?
That of collective celebration.
Collective celebration, and the key word being, well, 2 keywords, but collective is very important. These were not films like Michael Moore about individuals. These were films about groups, right? And the wonderful thing about Balayapal is there's a lot of interviewing and witnessing directed directly at the camera, but it's always a collective voice, except for the shopkeepers. They are individuals, but the citizens, the fishermen and the women are speaking as a group. They stand in front of the camera as a group, and the voice passes from one person to the next. It's very collective, and it's a wonderful, I think, indicator of the social values of their community.
To add to that, there's one frame in that film that I remember very vividly is.
Can you use the mic, please, Rajan?
When we're talking about collective celebration, there's a particular frame in the film which I remember very vividly is when these fishermen are carrying, in the last shot, are carrying a boat which is quite heavy outside the sea. I felt that that collectiveness there, and that is a frame that sticks through me. They pull the boat out and take it
But
somewhere else.
my point in this case was a bit different. When I meant collective celebration, I obviously, meant not obviously, I should have clarified, I meant the transmission of political memory, how the manifestation, how the execution of political action, the political act as, for example, the protest, how that is transmitted by the fiction. If you consider it that way, if you consider political memory to be part of social memory, of the social framework of memory, Cadre socio as they call it. So in that case, it can be called a continuity that exists between all these films and also other political films that have been made later on board.
So the demonstrators always have in mind future generations and transmitting their actions.
Rather, I think the people who look back, like for us, for example, we're looking back at these films with a distance of at least 100 years, if not more. I mean, 1920 to 1925, and now it's 2017. So, about a political film, when it is agitprop, for example, there's one trope that continually comes to our mind, which was there, which we also associated very directly with Indonesia calling, that of collective celebration. A collective comes together in order to demonstrate and manifest their ideology, their ideological stance. So I think not only in these films, but also maybe other films. For example, if you take the Indonesia calling also. So this transmission of political memory and the political act of collective celebration, not celebration, rather collective protest. Protest also becomes a sort of celebration at one point of time. If you consider the local, if you consider the contemporary movements that have happened in India, and JNU, Jadavpur, So I think this is one trope, that of the collective celebration of the political ideology, of political ideology. This is something that is a continuity.
I agree with you completely. I also like the word celebration because it partly also implies pleasure,
Yes.
collective joy, and play. And when all these women are blowing their conch shells.
Yes.
Conch shells, excuse me. This is a paunch, and conch is what you, okay. Conch shells or beating their tally. There's pleasure in this, isn't there?
Yes.
In the noise, in the unified action.
Yes.
And there's pleasure in being together in a march.
It's also an imitation of the bourgeois world, isn't it? It's where the bourgeois celebrates victory, celebrates individual possession through the inclusion of the sound production act, the conch shell, for example. It is something that is very, very much associated with religious cultures. But to include that in a film that is obviously very leftist, is something that probably could be called a writing back, or maybe I don't know. If you can, I think you get my drift.
The politics are not as explicit in terms of a party line or a dogmatic interpretation as they are in the 1930s films. It's basically a kind of populist resistance to the state, isn't it? There are no names attached to this politics. I want to make 2 points. You mentioned sound. So obviously this is a crucial disjuncture between the first 3 films and the last film. In the first 3 films, we did see people speaking. They're full of conversation and speech making and political discussion, but it's all silent. They make up for it as best they can with the intertitles. but in fact, the witnessing we see is not taken all the way. So this technological breakthrough that allowed Valiapal to record collective speech had tremendous repercussions for political filmmaking. You could see it in Indonesia Calling, where it's at a kind of early primitive technological state. These filmmakers had to borrow sound trucks from the commercial newsreel companies, wheel the trucks into this static platform place, and record the little snippets of speech. That's all we heard. Then the quality was so bad they had to post-dub it anyway. The really primitive early stage of sound recording. But you can see the difference between Indonesia Calling and Valiapal. It's a kind of paradigm, a huge paradigm shift for political. People's voices are crucial to the realization of this ideal of committed documentary. Anyone else who hasn't spoken? Margarita?
What I found striking in the last three films is the merging of the public and private spheres. Especially in Voices from Badiapal, we see women who normally take care of their houses have stepped forward, have come to the public space, and have joined men, right? So the barrier between the two genders is breaking down, which is very clearly visible. Even in Borinaj, we see the same pattern. So, am I right in?
It's a very good point. Borinaj takes the film production right inside people's homes, which I believe is not the case in Valiapal, right? I guess the fishers' huts are too small and dark to bring the electrical equipment in, or they made a decision not. When they took the electrical equipment into the miners' shacks in Borinaj, the sudden addition of heat and light brought out all the vermin in the walls. So the walls started crawling with silverfish and bed bugs and everything. So it was like a real important intrusion into private space. But you're making a very important point, and we see in Borinaj private space as political. When this woman, her coins that her teenage son brings back in his weekly payroll, this is a political act, isn't it? And when she is starting the fire in her stove with kindling that she has ripped from the wall because she can't afford any other fuel, this is also a political act. So politics is brought into the home, not to mention child caring and child health. The doctor's examination of the kids is a really searing scene in that film. So I think you're making an important point. And in Valiapal, it's interesting how the cooking vessels are transformed into political megaphones, aren't they? Instead of cooking in or serving food on the tally, it's become an instrument, a loud instrument of protest. Any other points anyone wants to make? Disjunctures or continuities among the four films? Neha.
Yeah. I could be wrong.
I'm sure you've never been wrong before.
No, but there is this.
We're not getting you.
Hello.
In the first three films, we have seen workers or the protesters. They communicate amongst themselves. But in Balyapal, what I've noticed is that, or maybe like I missed a scene, but then it's mostly talking to the camera. The workers are not talking amongst themselves. Like I don't recall a scene like that. So I think this is I don't know. This is I think a very big divergence that Balyapal takes from the other films. Like, I don't know, is that a conscious decision or not? Uh, though the workers work together, there are shots of them working together, etc. But there's no shot of them communicating. Like,
So either instinctually or deliberately, the filmmakers focused on direct address of the citizens to the camera, whereas in the other films, the filmmakers are observing people, forming communities, having discussions, taking action together. Maybe that's also because the first three films are a silent medium, but it's a very interesting point. Just one other additional point I want to make. Arjun talks, and Rajni and Marguerite talk about looking ahead, in a kind of utopian futuristic vision in all of the films. I think it's important also that Balyapal is looking back to, there's a kind of pastoral vision. This was a land created by God. God came down and made this a very special place. We have this heaven on earth that we are losing. It's a kind of pastoral discourse. It's also very romanticized. I mean, everyone knows that they are not living in a utopia. If you look carefully, you can see social boundaries within this community, class divisions. You can see all these things, but people are romanticizing the past and the present in terms of possible loss. In the other films, that is not happening, is it? They are not quite so sentimental. They appeal to feelings, but pathos is not necessarily sentimentality, is it? There are very strong feelings in the other films, especially Borealis, but they very carefully avoid excessive or unjustified feeling, which we would call sentimentality. If I have one criticism of Balyapal, I think that there is a kind of excessive emphasis on the pastoral, on idealization of this place and this community that is about to be lost. Any thoughts on that? I mean, it's a common attitude of urban intellectuals going to a beachside paradise, isn't it? I feel this way. These are wonderful places. They're so green, and the coconut palms are beautiful, but there's a kind of sentimentality in that I think these young filmmakers may be subject to. Just a thought. Okay, any other? Yes.
Contrary, I think even if
We need a microphone, please.
actually, on the contrary, I think in Voices from Balyapal, they were actually the people were actually giving expressions to. I don't know why it's not working. It's not working anyway. They were actually giving expressions, spontaneous expressions to their what they think. I mean, their emotional attachment. I thought it was. I mean, no pioneering slogan, no one individual hero emerged from that movement. Unlike what happened in Jadavpur, what happened in Day-2, I mean, certain taglines, certain slogans become the mouthpiece of certain movement. In Balyapal, I thought, even though they were speaking directly to the camera, unlike the other movies, which were more closer to the features, Balyapal was more close to what a documentary should be. So I thought they were actually giving honest expressions to their attachments. I mean, it was pretty clear from their emotional upheavals, their intonations, which were going from one stage to another. You remember the old man
he was like yeah, an emotional upheaval and all. So that way, I thought that was the disjuncture of this film from the other ones.
Also, if you just step outside of the ambit of the documentary for a bit, with no, I don't mean any offense, Thomas, but just stepping outside of the ambit of the documentary, there's a deep mythological, rather deep mythic culture associated with Balyapal that the other films do not have. And that is, because Balyapal is in Balasur, Odisha, and the myth that makes Odisha a special place is that whereas it's of course a Hindu myth, and lore has it, whereas in other lands, God manifested himself as a deity. In Odisha, he came to Odisha as a tree, and then the tree was turned into an image, which is why I probably think that the emotional upheaval that she was speaking about is more strident there in the words of the in the demonstrations of the, because there is somewhere I think a religious perspective also. You know,
So you have some, for interpreting a film, for hearing people's voices as authentic and natural, one needs some basic cultural tools. So myself as an outsider wasn't really plugged into that cultural context. I accept that. That's a very interesting point.
So I don't think it's very relevant to reading the point that I made. It's not very relevant to reading the documentary, but it is very important in the context if you look at the historical context of Balyapal.
Okay, two more questions. What about the, Rajni, you want to add a point?
Thomas, it's just my observation, but I wanted you to comment a little bit on this. You know, when I was watching Kino Pravda or any of the film, that it also had some bit of pessimistic approach, in the sense I could see the concept of the death lurking somewhere around the corner. But this concept of death came very, very evident in the last film, The Voices from Balyapal, where people were ready to throw themselves to the government vehicles, and lay their lives. Can you just comment on this whole death idea of death?
We're talking about, in both cases, well, in Balyapal, we're talking about a kind of martyrdom, aren't we? A kind of community sacrifice that people are willing to make. And that really firms up the rhetorical and emotional register of the film. In Kino Pravda, I thought you were going to refer to the scene with the bakers and in the sanatorium where the poor starving children are there. And this is a kind of humanitarian appeal. In 1922, just in the footsteps of the Civil War, there's still a lot of famine and social upheaval in the Soviet Union, and so there's an appeal to the citizens to come to the rescue of these children. I think that that's not so much about martyrdom or revolutionary sacrifice as it is about a humanitarian crisis, and the state has a new role of looking after people. The interesting thing to me in that film, in that section, is that we see a public rehabilitation center for victims of paralysis or other injuries. We actually see the state inventing machines for exercise. This is what I've been going through with my knee. in 1922, it was unheard of for any state to take charge of citizens' health and medicine and rehabilitation. So I would say those images are much stronger than the humanitarian crisis, the starving children. But it's amazingly frank, the images of the starving children. And it's easy to describe these newsreels as propaganda, as Soviet propaganda, Bolshevik propaganda. And I've heard this. But in fact, to acknowledge this social crisis of famine, starvation, and destitute children is amazingly frank for so-called propaganda, isn't it? I don't know whether that answers your question, but it adds to the complexity of the films. Mentioning the word newsreel, I think is also important. I wanted to come back to that. I think all 4 films use the newsreel template as a basic tool, right? Here in India, the newsreels have disappeared from the theaters, right? And no one here probably remembers them, but there used to be commercial news packages that were delivered before the feature film. And these started in the 1920s and went right up until the 1980s, really. Short journalistic films that emphasized information, current events. So all 4 of these filmmakers are providing alternative newsreels, the news that the commercial newsreels are not including. So the objective of information, of sharing data, is absolutely crucial. This is the first objective of all the films. And then what they do beyond sharing information is, I think, varies from film to film. Whether they're talking about providing exemplary action for us to imitate, or whether they're providing other solutions, or what. The information, the alternative information is basic. And another point I want to make is about the overall structure of all 4 of the films. All of them have a basic narrative to them, except maybe Vertov, which the package we looked at is episodic, right? It's much more a serial format than a narrative format. And in fact, it says to be continued in the next chapter, doesn't it? But the others all have a kind of narrative structure. The Hunger March ends in Washington and all the speeches in Washington, right? Borinage ends in the defiant demonstration, and the titles that predict the utopian future of the proletarian dictatorship, right? That is a happy ending. This is a real narrative, happy ending, isn't it? And then the Balayapal ends in the mass demonstration of defiance. So they all have a kind of romantic narrative trajectory ending in the climax, don't they? The other thing that they have, more or less, is individual characters. I think the individual characters are strongest in Balayapal, even though they're always part of a group, because of the voices. But even in Borinage, you can see that Evans is creating individual characters, like the teenage miner and his mother, or the father and his pregnant wife, the father who has to ride his cycle so many kilometers to pick up one loaf of bread. So there's emerging in his idiom the necessity of showing characters. In my book that you've read, you've glimpsed already, I argue that this is one of the lessons he learned on his trip to the Soviet Union, where the Soviet filmmakers were introducing socialist realism and the mode of personification, creating I have water, thanks. It's no problem. Imitating socialist realist characterization, ideal romanticized characters that are fulfilling exemplary action. And clearly in Borinage, the one that stands out to me are not the victims, but the triumphant ones. This woman who saves her house, isn't she amazing? The woman who tricks the bailiff and is able to keep her furniture, right? Isn't that an amazing little character? It only lasts like 2 minutes, but she and all of her friends are dramatizing this scene in which she has taken action and she saved her house. So this is a trend that is going to be becoming even more prevalent in Ethan's work, what he called personification, creating larger and larger characters, which he hoped his audience would plug into. You could also argue that in this way he's also imitating Hollywood, and his generation of filmmakers moving on into the late 30s really wanted to show their films in the theaters, and so their agenda was very much a kind of imitation of Hollywood. The 3 films you're going to look at this evening at 4 o'clock from evens in the late 30s and early 40s all show this growing personification. Okay, we have 10 more minutes. Have we covered all of the shared images, iconographies, tropes of the 4 films? Is there anything I've left out that you want to add?
I think if you could comment about the rhetorics a bit, Thomas.
Well, a rhetoric is a discursive tool for expressing social or affective modes, right? And I think all 4 share a kind of affective mode of defiance, of anger and denunciation, but at the same time, hope, this kind of utopian promise of the future. And these are constructed in various ways of what the people are saying, or you could also say in Valley Pal, the gorgeous landscape cinematography is a kind of rhetoric of hope and promise, right? There's so much emphasis on this landscape. Yeah.
Yeah. So what I wanted to ask you, Thomas, the rhetoric that is very evident in these films, and what I said about collective celebration, you made what you said just now about hope, a utopian hope, and that of condemnation. Does this manifestation of collective celebration veer somewhere in between condemnation and hope? Somewhere in between these two rhetorical tropes?
There are fluctuations because you can't express hope without a crisis.
So you cannot. Okay.
So all of them have this kind of narrative structure of crisis and then hope and solutions, don't they? Borinage is also unique in terms of a tone that comes up only a few times. It's not only critique and denunciation, but it's also a kind of bitter irony. Cuts the shots of the Museum of Hygiene right next door to the workers' shanties and their terrible living conditions. This is a juxtaposition, a very simple editing trope that is savagely ironic, isn't it? Or when he intercuts between the church and the material reality of these people's lives. This is again a kind of ironic trope. He also uses compilation or this archival footage to intersect with the live action footage, create these kinds of oppositions or contradictions. Contradiction is a very important concept in Marxism, and he is probably performing really basic contradictory tropes just through this kind of ironic editing, isn't he? I think he had been reading Eisenstein or watching Eisenstein and just does so in a very simple way. One of his hobbies in Amsterdam in earlier years was to grab the commercial newsreels from the theaters and re-edit them and show them in workers' clubs to create these oppositional ironies, and then edit them back into their original shape and return them to the theaters, and no one would know. So this was very good practice for him in developing a film like Alia Pal. The other point, I think, before we wrap up is social practice. What all four of these films have in common is something about the relationship of the filmmakers with their subjects. Can anyone sort of elaborate on that? I think the evidence is on the screen of all four films. What do we see on the screen in terms of the relationship of the artists and their subjects? Any thoughts about that?
It's a suspension of intimacy, I think.
You mean we are professional filmmakers and we are intruding on your lives, filming your starving children, and this is very embarrassing for you, but this is our job, and so therefore we're suspending this intimacy? Is that what you mean?
Not really that.
Okay.
I mean it from the perspective of an artist,
Uh-huh.
a filmmaker as an artist. Because making films that they're documenting the motion of a certain societal space. They're documenting the dissent that is being voiced by a certain societal space. In that case, I think the doubts, the possibilities, the probabilities that often occur to an artist while they're making a film or painting, or doing a painting or taking a photograph, all those probabilities, improbabilities, all those, I think, are suspended. All those personal probabilities and improbabilities are suspended because there's a commitment, an ideological commitment working for the artist at that point of time. I mean the suspension of intimacy like that.
Okay, so they don't believe, they don't belong to the me generation. These filmmakers do not belong to the me generation, the confessional industry of the 21st century, do they? Their work is not about them personally. They don't use the I word. That's a very good point. They submit their own subjectivity to the subjectivity of their subjects. Very, yeah, that's really important. And when we get to, 80 years later, when we get to Michael Moore, who does use the I word, he delivers similar political messages, but through the kind of autobiographical, confessional mode.
Also, if you contrast, if you cross these 80 years, come to Michael Moore, and then again go back to, let's say Kino Pravda, then what you see is, as you said, the same message that is being transmitted in a different mode, but that suspension of intimacy that is there in these films, in Michael Moore, for example, if you look at Michael Moore, he uses that suspension of intimacy as a tool. in order to create a confessional mood. I think this, I'm not being able to express it.
No,
clearly.
it is a very complicated shift, and there's only one exception that I would mention. Top film, Pino Pravda, as I said, contains a little scene where Vertov is shown on the tramway reading the newspaper. So you can think of this as sort of like a little Hitchcock vignette of the filmmaker on the screen, right? But he also belongs to a generation of modernist artists where the artist's body is very often the raw material of the art. Certainly in the performing arts in the 1920s among the modernists, but also
This is high modernism.
yeah. So maybe that's where he's coming from. What was his instinct? I'm going to be in this film. I'll play this little role, sort of like a wink, wink, wink device. Does anyone recognize me? But you also see him and his colleagues setting up the projector in the public square. That is a kind of self-reflexivity that is much more instrumental, isn't it? He is showing his audience, here is how we make a film, here is how we show a film. So in that sense, the kind of self-reflexivity is very, it ties in with the overall agenda, social and political agenda of the film, showing the citizen the workings of their new emerging society. What I was also aiming for was to recapitulate some of the ideas about committed cinema that were in the essay that you read for today. An ideal of committed cinema in terms of filmmaking practice. These filmmakers are all not just making films, and they're not just making films for people, they're making films with people. So this is a very complex ideal of what you might call contextual or collaborative filmmaking that I think all four films aspire to and successfully realize. The trap of outsider filmmaking or objectifying filmmaker, objectification of the other, I'm sure you agree with me, is avoided in all four of these films. There's no kind of exoticization or orientalization of the subject that comes out of this collaborative spirit. Evans was a Dutchman. What is he doing in this French-speaking miners region? I mean, he spoke French, but he was an outsider. But it's not as if he parachuted in, made a film exoticizing these people, and then parachuted out. He was invited in. He worked with local activists on the ground. The doctor we saw examining the children was one of the activists in the miners community. So it's an important deal of committed documentary that I want to emphasize that is exemplified by all four of these films. Okay, we've been in almost an hour. Is there a final question of anyone before we wrap up and take our tea break? Before I lose my voice completely. Any final question?
I don't think so. I think we've covered all the grounds.
Thanks to you, Arjun, for your great comment. Okay, so we'll take a break. We'll reconvene at noon.
Yeah, tea is awaiting.
Tea is awaiting. Thank you.
पूरी छः प्लस एकदम बासी प्रोडक्शन गाने बहुत जाने और टाटा की तुम सुनी प्रोडक्शन
Are Rajni and Margarita coming back in?
Yes, yes.
So we'll just wait 1 minute. Are the others out in the corridor there? Are they?
I think that
We can start.
Okay. Let's get started. Okay. So this lecture pertains to the specific reading that I assigned from Evans' evolution from his roots in the avant-garde culture of Amsterdam and his movement towards a kind of international political practice that I call radical, choosing my words very carefully. There is a still, a production still from the shoot in the Borinage, which I'm finding very interesting because it does first of all, production stills are very rare for documentaries. No one cares about documenting the scene of a documentary. Everyone is so focused on producing the work that they don't think about documenting the work. So this is a very rare shot, and it really shows the community participation in the filming. Kids on the set, for example, and the kids playing around or watching the camera operator. I'm not sure whether this is Evans or this is Evans. This is the French cameraman that they brought in to do it. It's possible this also might be Evans, but I don't think so. But do you remember the shot through the doorway into the house where the woman is preparing to save her furniture from the bailiff? This is what is being filmed. And you can see how tiny the house is and how difficult it must have been to shoot inside, but they insisted and actually carried it out. I don't know what this guy is doing, but it's a wonderful detail, textured detail of the community at work producing this film. Okay, so from the bridge to the Borinage, the bridge being Evans' first film from 1928, and the following 6 years that culminated in Borinage, which was the last film he made in Europe before he made another trip to the Soviet Union and then to America. After that, he didn't return to the Netherlands until the 60s. Okay, so there's a little. I'd like to discuss some of the problems in our methodology again, and see if you have some thoughts about this. The two illustrations are, first of all, the cover from the publication of the cinephile organization that Evans was one of the leaders of in Amsterdam in the mid to late 20s, Filmliga. Does anyone know Dutch? It's the monthly on film art, and art is a key word because it's very much a group of cinephiles who are interested in avant-garde artistic expression, and we're very negative about mass commercial entertainment. And then on the right is a poster that, for me, embodies some of the aesthetics of the doctrine of socialist realism that was formally instituted around 1934, 1936 in the Soviet Union, and that really influenced Evans on his 3 trips there in the early 30s and mid 30s. I think this influence has been underestimated by everyone else writing on Evans. And I'm naming names and talking about actual tropes and patterns of socialist realism that he absorbed on his trips and from looking at Soviet films is very important. When I started this book on Evans, I was a doctoral student like some of you in the 1970s. He was my thesis topic, which I started in 1974 and defended in 1981. And then it took me another 34 years to render it expanded into a big fat book. So this was a kind of career-long activity, often interrupted. But what happened when the book came out was people would say to me, isn't the auteur method a little bit outdated? No one writes books on filmmakers anymore. And it's true. It's a little bit old-fashioned to devote an entire study to an artist, a single author, the auteur. In the 70s, in the context in which I was being trained, it was the default method. I studied under Andrew Saras, who invented auteurism, which was the doctrine that filmmakers, even in the Hollywood machine, are the determining influences on the work of art. So the auteur as a methodology was the default method in the 1970s. And by the time the book came out 40 years later, it seemed curiously old-fashioned. Is it a valid method? It's a very good question. Obviously, I have stood by it, and I think there's something important to be learned about following a single artist's subjectivity between 1912 and 1988 when he died. 88 or 89? 89 when he died. That is 77 years, isn't it? But the study isn't a standard auteur study, which looks at a personal sensibility as it's manifested in artistic production throughout a career, as it evolves and shifts throughout a career. Rather, for me, this auteur study even epitomizes a kind of political documentary throughout the 20th century. Someone working between 1912 and 1989 is really standing in for an important trajectory in film history, the 20th century, aren't they? So he stands in, and I think because he was such carnivorous creature absorbing influences from everywhere. Every key issue in the history of the documentary in these 70 odd years emerges in his work. For example, the evolution of technology, the introduction of sound. His first works were silent, and then as sound technology evolved, his work kept pace with the evolution of sound technology. When the new portable cameras were introduced in the 1960s and 1970s, again, his work kept pace. So he stands in, he epitomizes 20th century documentary in an important way. The fact that he was also, he was known as the Flying Dutchman, and he worked on every inhabited continent and in more than a dozen societies and cultures. And of course, everywhere he went, he was like a sponge, soaking up influences and cultural issues. So in many ways, he stands in for a kind of international progress, or not progress, an international trajectory, an international journey of the documentary film throughout the century. So obviously his Latin American films are very different from his one African film, which is very different from the Indonesian, Australian film that we looked at. So he's a really key figure in 20th century documentary. I think he also stands in for the hopes and the dreams of the committed documentary of the left as a film producing community throughout all of this time. He started his work in the first decade after the Soviet Revolution, the Bolshevik Revolution, and gradually assumed a kind of allegiance to the ideals of that revolution, and stubbornly stuck to that allegiance in the coming decades. There are several milestones in the history of the left in the 20th century where party members would drop out, right? For example, in 1939, when Stalin made a pact with Hitler to stop the Nazi aggression against Russia, and for the two parties to absorb Poland and the Baltic countries. There was a huge wave of dropouts from the Communist Party in the West because of the really perfidious cynicism of that deal. Later on, after the war, during the Red Scare, are you all familiar with the Red Scare? The anti-left panic in US politics and cultures in which communist members and leftists were purged from the civil service and from the film industry. There were a lot of dropouts then. Throughout all of this, he stuck to his guns. In the 1960s, when the Soviet Union went through a thaw, a contradictory thaw, and on the right-hand side became a somewhat more liberal society, but on the left-hand side invaded Czechoslovakia, first Hungary in 1956, and then Czechoslovakia in 1968. Both events led to another wave of dropouts from this allegiance. Again, even stuck to his guns for his own reasons, but shifted his interest away from the Soviet Union towards Maoist China, People's Republic of China, and he made a great epic in the 1970s exploring Mao's Cultural Revolution. We're not going to be looking at that in this course, or I suppose I can show you a glimpse if you wanted to. So right up until the very end, we must see him as a proponent of leftist ideals and goals within the documentary film scene. Does he stand in for this constituency? Can we think of the left community throughout these 80 years as a kind of author. I think it's an interesting concept. How have the ideals and the objectives of the left as cultural producers shifted between the teens and the late 1980s? So his work vividly documents that. So all of these things are going on in my study. It's much less a personal study, although I'm very interested in his work biographically. And I have lots of gossip I can tell you about his life if you'd like to know. But I'm less interested in the biography that many of the authors on Evans have taken up. For example, they talk about his Catholic childhood and his inherent mysticism, his pantheistic mysticism that comes from his Catholic childhood, brought up on the banks of a river in rural Holland. I'm a little bit less interested in that than in the other aspects that we've been talking about. This is a kind of backdrop to my focus on Evans in my own work and in these weeks, the first half of the seminar. And I hope that you discover this artist as a kind of example of several currents in film history of interest to you. After he died, they did a big retrospective of Evans at the Mumbai International Film Festival. And I didn't realize that Evans had such a following in India. He never shot here. To my knowledge, he never even came here. But this retrospective was mobbed. Couldn't believe it. A huge crowd came out for this retrospective. Like, he had a reputation somehow that had reached even the shores of India. And his widow was there, his collaborator, Marceline Loridan, who's a tiny little woman with a very high red hairdo. And I could never see her because she was surrounded by mobs of fans. All I could see was the little red hairdo sticking up above the heads of all her fans. She was so popular. So something sparked this energy, even in the Indian documentary and cinephile audience. And I think it was perhaps this progressive commitment, or else it was a kind of innovative track record in terms of development of a documentary language. I'm not sure, but his international reputation is certainly there. And I hope that you will find this work interesting. So today we're talking about his evolution from the avant-garde of the late 1920s to his, what I call, in short form, the Comintern. His work in Borinage, which was much more attached to the international communist movement of the day. Of course, dictated to by Moscow, hence the Third Communist International. And so we're going to be talking about how the shifts in his artistic practice and his social practice between 1928 and 1934 stands in for this evolution. As I was developing this lecture, I realized that I have not shown you anything from his avant-garde period. I think I would like to do that. So in a minute, we will look at the 16-minute film, The Bridge, his first bridge, that really epitomizes his avant-garde period. But first, I wanted to ask you an auteur question. Okay, an auteurist question. The auteurist skills are involve identifying a personal sensibility at work in a series of films. Now you have seen 3 Evans films, right? You've seen Borinage, Indonesia Calling, or you've just seen 2. Okay, you've seen 2 Evans films. If you did not know anything about Evans, and you saw these 2 films that were unsigned, uncredited, would you identify them as being coming from the same personal sensibility? And what might the traces of that sensibility be in the two films? Borinaj, Indonesia Calling, made 12 years later.
Certainly a line of development.
Sorry?
There's certainly a line of development, a linear development, more a polishing of form.
Is the original even still recognizable in 1946?
I think yes.
What are the specific traces?
Very hard to pin that. Yes, certainly the formal technology, if you can say, if you want to call it that. Very hard to pin it.
Formal technology. Okay. Anyone else? If you were a detective, what would be the evidence that would trace those two films to the same author?
The staccato movement, probably, whereas in Indonesia Calling, it's much more staccato. In the later film, it's less staccato. I'm not a very good detective, so obviously I can't.
Use the mind. So your body
He just said that he confessed that he's not a good detective.
No, I heard it. I still requested you to use the mind
Because
because of
it's
the
being recorded. So as I said, I mean, Indonesia Calling is much more staccato in its progression. There's linearity that is probably also very much available in his other film, and the staccato motion is less staccato than in Indonesia Calling. So as I said, I'm not a very good detective, so I cannot really identify. And also, I'm not very familiar with filmic criticism, so
Okay.
it's very difficult to recognize it. But pin it down.
Let's see if there are any
I'm sure there's-
detectives.
Poito, anybody?
I can't hold my images from
When I show you the bridge in 1 minute, your eyes will light up because you will see the bridge and the harbor of Rotterdam, and you will tell me that 20 years after the bridge, Evans is remaking the bridge in Sydney, Australia. So that's why I'm delaying this. But in Indonesia Calling and Borinaj, any evidence of a personal sensibility? I mean, obviously, there's the ideological commitment. There's the trope of the demonstration. There are the little anecdotal details. For example, in both films, the workers are forbidden from assembling and are pretending to play cards in the doorway and to assemble at a moment's notice and then disperse. You notice that? So probably Evans in Australia suggested this to his subjects that, oh, this worked really well in Belgium 12 years ago, let's try that. Is there anything else? Some even scholars have talked about the elements, water and air and fire as a kind of continuous iconography, and certainly water, the harbor and the ocean and the port city are very important in Indonesia Calling. You can't really say that in Borinaj, or can you? Can you talk about this desolate, filthy urban landscape with the mountains of coal dust and the devastated dwellings? Can you talk about that as a kind of sensitivity to landscape and nature. Okay, so keep that question in mind as we look at bridge, all right? So just a word introducing the bridge. It's 16 minutes. Evans was the young cast working for his family company that sold cameras. And he joined this group of artists, experimental artists and cinephiles in Amsterdam, and was looking for a topic for his first film. He wanted to employ all of the ideas about editing and cinematography that he had been developing. And so someone suggested there's a bridge that crosses the Rhine River in Rotterdam. Make a film about that. So he thought that's a good idea. And it was a good idea. It deploys a lot of the interests of the 1920s avant-garde. You've heard of the artistic movements of the 1920s, like futurism and constructivism. And there were fantasies in experimental filmmaking communities about making machine films. There were lots of examples of city films, so it's very much film that's part of the 1920s. I think that even if you don't recognize that, you will understand that when you see the film. Okay, here we go. And I'm very sorry, this one is silent also.
They got him a worldwide reputation and a great following both in Amsterdam and ironically in the Soviet Union. And the filmmakers started dropping in on Amsterdam to meet him, and his career was launched. As I said, it shows a lot of the fetish interests of the 1920s. I closed my PowerPoint. The dream of pure abstraction, for example, and we only see that in the very last image where the animated cube goes back and forth towards your eye. Let me find the PowerPoint first, excuse me. The fantasy of a machine film that has no human presence whatsoever. In fact, some of the critics said to him, there are too many human beings in this film. You should have eliminated them completely. And you could have had this complete mechanical dance on screen. But in fact, I think his insistence on showing human agency is very prophetic of his own work in later years, where he's very interested in the human universe, not in the mechanical universe. He isn't a very good futurist. He isn't a very good constructivist. He doesn't praise technology in the abstract. He praises it as a tool for human development. Do any of you have any observations or questions on the bridge? We had a round of applause, which I think is in 4 lectures and 1 screening session, unprecedented. So that means you like the film. Any comments or questions?
It's a wonderful film. Continue.
No, what I
Could you use the microphone?
what is very interesting about the film is that it is a machine looking at other machines. Like, you know, it's not the human eye. So, and the very first shot of the small camera, I mean, that kind of tells you how machines are being looked at. Machines are being looked at through a machine. So, and I think the first films, like if you go back to Lumiere Brothers, also, like, you know, this trajectory was there also. You know, a machine looking at other machines, how other machines work, because human eye cannot get into the positions that the camera got into. Like, you know, so that is a very interesting thing about.
So, as Benjamin argues in the piece that some of you have read, cinema allows a new kind of optics, a new kind of vision, and this embodies that. Yeah.
Also to you know, kind of and this is obviously, like, you know, in the film that we saw yesterday, that is there's a difference from this film, because this film is about, like you said, it's the dance of the machines, and then that's like more that's the more human universe. So I think his kind of, there's a shift from in his like, I've just seen, this is my first introduction to him, so I'm not sure of like, you know, his entire body of work, his corpus, the corpus of the work that he produced, but like just looking at these 2 films, like, you know, Borinage and this and Bridge, like I think that the thing changed, like, you know, his shift, like his slant changed from like more from this like interest in machines to interest in the human universe. And that is what I observed.
I think you're absolutely right. Anyone else? Okay, in the excerpt that you've been reading, Evans explains very clearly why he abandoned this interest in abstraction, in the avant-garde, and moved in the direction of social commitment. And I just want to remind you of his own exact words in that. Sorry, I'm getting confused. I have two screens going. There we go. Six years later, Borinage became a great turning point in my work, a big switch in form, content, and method, because in two of my earlier films, I started to become slick. Slick is a good word also to describe the bridge, isn't it? You can tell he edited this film for months and months and got everything perfect. He studied the bridge also for months before he started filming. Everything is perfect, everything is slick. All tricks of filmmaking I had mastered, technical proficiency, but I had no way of using what I'd found in Russia, the feeling of what the hell it's all about. So you could argue in the bridge, he shows us an apparatus, but he misses what it's really about. You could argue it's a city film, it's about the economics of the city. It's a narrative of this train transporting goods that wants to cross the river and has to wait for the ships. You could argue it's about the economics of this great port city, one of the largest ports in the world. But he says, I didn't know what the hell it was about. Stress, complete participation, absorption in lives, fight against mine owners, this is in Borinage. A very simple style, away from fancy camera movements, fancy lights, no payment. I lived on money earned from commercial jobs. This happens to all artists. Artisans, excellent style. Their work continues the same style all life. This is the graveyard of artists and writers. But must choose, must make, clean break. And this is how he envisions the movement from the bridge to the Borinage, clean break. And it's quite a dramatic paradigm shift. I'm sure you would agree. And one of the points that comes up in his development of a new form and a new practice is to distinguish himself from the other artistic currents of the early 30s, especially in photography, that became known as the new objectivity. And your article by Benjamin that you've also been reading also makes this contrast. New objectivity photography was supposed to be getting close to the world, to be completely objective about the objects of the world, the earth, the planet, the landscape, human society. But according to Evans, there are two examples of it up there. One of the best known new objectivity photographers, whose name was Albert Renger-Pach, you can see why, and then a still from Borinage below, you can see why he separated himself from this aesthetic of realism that objectified and aestheticized the universe rather than creating this kind of material beauty without engaging with human society. He rejected the danger, what he called the danger of aesthetic pleasure in Borinage. And we've discussed some of the ways by which he distinguished himself by the new objectivity. One of them was to downplay the aesthetics of his shots, to avoid any kind of aestheticization of poverty, as he called it, because so many of the new objectivity photographers rather, photographed poverty, but made the ugliness of poverty look beautiful. And he wanted to avoid that. He wanted to maintain what he called accusation, wanted his tone to be accusatory. So in this shot, in this woman's kitchen, it's very straightforward, it's very expository, there's no aestheticization, it just shows the action bluntly and straightforwardly, rather than finding a kind of aesthetic shape or an aesthetic dynamic to it. Benjamin called the style of the new objectivity photography modish techniques, stylish techniques, and he praised Evans and Vertov for rejecting that temptation. The other thing that he did to reject this temptation was to use captions, to use text and the relationship of text with image. So throughout Borinage, you recall the intertitles and how important they are in portraying objective information about what he is filming, about the history of this community, about the stakes in their struggle, and even provides a kind of interpretation at the end, an ambiguity. You could argue that these typical photos above are ambiguous in terms of human work on the right, as a fisherman, or architecture and technology and industry on the left. They're strikingly composed, but they're ultimately ambiguous. Captions are used in Borinage to eschew and fashionable modish ambiguity. Okay, we've talked about some of the other aspects of his practice, for example, his collaborative practice with the community. Obviously, he was collaborating with the engineer, the bridge engineer, but the collaboration in Borinage went far beyond that. It was the citizens' initiative inviting him to their community to make the film that is the key. And I just want to read one more little excerpt because we're suddenly out of time. And I'll just read this quickly. Here's his comment about the final titles of Borinage, where you remember the caption says, Um, this struggle is not lost because we're confident in the eventual victory of the proletariat. Remember that? Here's what he says about this. We intended to give to the workers this certitude that a strike is never lost, that even a provisional defeat is only a stage of the struggle, and that the struggle continues on the basis of workers united for precise goals. It's at this period that I began to feel deeply the unity that must exist between the artist and man. That really sums up the essential shift for him in terms of his relationship as an artist and the human community that he was serving. So tonight, when we look at 3 films from later in the 1930s, there they are. I think that you will also see them as an embodiment of this new relationship. We will continue talking about these aspects of his work tomorrow morning. Is there any final question or comment so far? Is anyone afraid of heights?
Oh.
I would never have climbed up on that bridge with that little camera. So he was very brave, right?
Serious vertigo.
Okay, any final comments or questions? Okay, so we'll see you in 3 hours.
Yes.
Enjoy your lunch.
Oh,